The Minnesota Timberwolves made some big moves in the offseason, and we're seeing right now to start the season that it hasn't necessarily been all good for them. Welcome back to State of the Association. I'm your host, Nash Roberts. So, of course, the biggest deal was that Cat for Randall and Dante DiVincenzo trade, but they made some other moves in the offseason too. They had some losses. So, before we get to the big blockbuster move, I'm going to talk about some key losses that they've had that were more rotational players. Namely, I would like to point out Kyle Anderson, Jordan McLaughlin, and Monte Morris. And none of those names are going to just reach out across the screen to you. But Kyle Anderson was, if nothing else, a solid, reliable wing for them and a good glue guy. But really, the main focus here is both Jordan McLaughlin and Monte Morris. These are guys that were originally brought in to help bolster that point guard depth because Mike Conley, he's only getting older. And Jordan McLaughlin had, to that point, been a Timberwolf all of his life. Ever since McLaughlin joined the NBA, he was a Minnesota Timberwolf. And he was never necessarily, he never got a lot of minutes. But what he did do in his limited time on the court was that he was a very efficient passer, despite his limited size, even at the point guard position. But ultimately, they decided that they could not trust McLaughlin to be the guy to consistently get minutes behind Mike Conley, so they also went out and they got Monte Morris. And he never reached the heights that I thought he might in Minnesota. And those heights aren't necessarily, all-star Monte Morris. But still, I expect him to be a little bit better there than he was. At the end of the day, though, that is a guy that you can trust to remain stable with the ball, not commit too many turnovers, and be just a solid facilitator for the team. But they lose those guys in the offseason. And as a result, your main point guard rotation right now this season has really just been Mike Conley because rookie Rob Dillingham, he hasn't got a lot of minutes there. I think he has a lot of high upside, especially alongside Anthony Edwards. But this team right now, they're mainly rolling with Mike Conley, and that's your only proper point guard right now. Now, there are guys who can take up for him, like Nickeil Alexander-Walker. He played the point in some of their playoff series, I believe, and he did really good there. Nickeil Alexander-Walker had a great playoff series. That's very much worth noting. I think he's a very underrated player. He's a great defender for that team. But in general, Nah isn't necessarily the person that most Timberwolves fans would like to be running the offense, and rightfully so. Julius Randle's also got some on-ball duty, and of course Anthony Edwards gets his own as well. But in terms of having that proper point guard, Mike Conley's not getting any younger, and you can usually always trust on him to, at bare minimum, be reliable. Ultimately, his game isn't one that you would think would really decline with age, and up till this season, it really hadn't. But Mike Conley this season has been less efficient, less safe to the ball, and not been the proper key contributor point guard that he has been in years past for his Minnesota Timberwolves team. And as a result, if that playmaking duty that's just over to a guy like Anthony Edwards or Julius Randle, those aren't necessarily the guys that are always looking out for others. And Ant's fine in that regard. He gets a decent amount of assists, but Randle, he's more focused on driving to the basket, and to that extent, Anthony Edwards is as well. So when you've got someone out there handling the ball besides Mike Conley, and you have to live with the non-Mike Conley minutes because of his age and because of his recent decline, you have to expect there's going to be moments where Mike Conley isn't going to be able to be your point guard. And he's had games like that where he has had limited minutes, or he's had games where he's taken off for rest, and you really don't have an answer for that because Rob Dillingham, as good as he has been in the limited minutes he gets, Chris Finch is a guy who, over recent years for the Minnesota Timberwolves as their head coach, he has been very, very lacking in terms of the minutes that he gives rookies. We saw it last year with Leonard Miller. I live in Oklahoma, so I got to go to see the Oklahoma City Thunder versus Minnesota Timberwolves. And Leonard Miller only came in at the very end of the game. He got a decent amount of buckets at the end there, but it was just all garbage time. And it just shows that Chris Finch doesn't really like to play his rookies. He prefers to, really let them develop in practice or in the G League, as opposed to actually being on the court. And that makes sense to an extent. Overall, the Timberwolves, despite their rough start to the season, they came into it at least looking like they wanted to be championship contenders. So it makes sense that you wouldn't want to necessarily inject rookies into the lineup. But when you're having to rest Mike Conley for some games, having to lower his minutes a little bit, and his age is really showing this year compared to years past, and I love Mike Conley, but it's definitely showing. you do have to allow yourself some more opportunities in game for a guy like Rob Dillingham to run that point guard position. And ultimately, Rob's a good scorer as well. He might also add to the issue of a guy looking for his shot first when he's handling the ball. But at the end of the day, you do have to give him a chance because that is your most natural point guard after Mike Conley, even if it's not necessarily what you would think of as a traditional point guard. He's much more of a scorer first guy. So that's my first major issue with the Minnesota Timberwolves is that point guard position. I think that mainly they were just betting on Mike Conley continuing to be very, very consistent, a very solid, stable point guard. But to this point in the season, he hasn't been the same guy that he once was. And ultimately, I think he can get back on track at bare minimum. He has a good basketball IQ, good mind for the game, just after all these years of playing. As well as being a good fit with the Timberwolves team, him and Rudy Gobert, they have experience going back in Utah. And Mike Conley was formerly the leader of that grit and grind Grizzlies team. And I think that is a culture that you can kind of relate to this current Minnesota Timberwolves team as well, just for their defensive approach and having multiple bigs out there in a league that is so often now dominated by small ball. But that is definitely my first major issue with the Timberwolves team is that point guard position. And I think if you were to bring back Jordan McLaughlin, or more likely Monte Morris, I think that that could have been fixed up a little bit. One person that I liked a lot for them that they could have traded for is Dennis Schroeder. He's having a great season right now over in Brooklyn. And the thing, right, when you're saying what a team needs, sometimes that player's just not always on the market. You can say that your team needs this certain archetype of player, but if there's not a feasible trade candidate or someone that they could get in free agency that's going to play consistent minutes, it's not really an argument you can make because what can the team really do if there's no one out there like that? If there's no one to fit the archetype of what they need. But Dennis Schroeder is one of the best players on that Brooklyn Nets team right now. He is a great perimeter defender. He's not quite Drew Holiday. He's not quite Marcus Smart, but he is a very good perimeter defender in his own right. He can score for himself, and he can also play make for others. I think that even coming off the bench for Mike Conley, Dennis Schroeder would have been a great pickup, a great trade for the Timberwolves to make. I would have loved his fit over in Minnesota. Ultimately, he stayed in Brooklyn. He's having a great season over there. Good for him. But I think he could have really contributed to this Minnesota Timberwolves team, especially since Chris Finch does not like playing his rookies. Guys like Rob Dillingham, I think Dennis Schroeder could have come in and been that point guard that the Timberwolves need when Mike Conley's resting. So that's the first guy with the Timberwolves, and a big factor, in my opinion, in terms of their performance this season, has been the sudden decline of Mike Conley. Because if you look at his production year by year, of course it's declined. He's had less of an important role in the offense in recent years compared to, his peak days over in Memphis, over in Utah. However, his impact on the game had not declined. His impact on the game was arguably better than ever in his new role in Minnesota and what he was able to do and just turn that team around because D'Angelo Russell, the point guard before him, he is a very volatile player. He has moments where he's really good, but in general, he is very volatile, very inconsistent, at times inefficient. So Mike Conley was a breath of fresh air. He's going to take less shots away from Anthony Edwards. He's going to just be able to get guys involved. He's got good chemistry with Rudy Gobert. The fit with Mike Conley over in Minnesota was great. But right now, his performance this season has steadily declined. He has not been the stable point guard that Timberwolves have needed. He has had more turnovers this season. And overall, that point guard position has been my biggest worry for them. Now, another issue I have has been Jaden McDaniels. This is someone who I really looked at as a potential breakout candidate this season. Now, J-Mac has been an elite defender for many years now. He was an all-defensive team member last year, and he really should have made it the year before. But at bare minimum, a one-time all-defensive team player, and that shows night in, night out. He has been a great defender that has continued. But the biggest knock on Jaden McDaniels has been his lack of offensive progression and just not being too aggressive on the offensive end, which could really take his game to that next level. And with the loss of Karl-Anthony Towns, I expected that Jaden McDaniels was going to take an offensive leap and add to his value even more, become a true important two-way piece for this team instead of a one-way on the defensive end. Now, his points per game are pretty consistent with last year, so at least that's not declining. But one you would kind of expect that to go up with the loss of Cat. One would think that that would allow more opportunities for Jaden because Julius Randle, as good as he can be, he's still not necessarily Karl Anthony Towns in terms of what he's going to do on the offensive end. He's kind of like a Cat light in terms of they have a similar play style, but Cat ultimately is the better offensive player and produces a little bit more. So you would think that that would open up more opportunities for Jaden McDaniels, but it really hasn't. And yes, his points per game are consistent with last year, but what is not is his efficiency is the worst it has been since the 2021-22 season, and that was the sophomore season. That's both his field goal percentage and his three-pointers, which are down to just 31.7%. And he was never a knockdown shooter, but if you go back to 2022-23, he was shooting almost 40%. And that went down a little bit last year to 34. But even then, 34 is serviceable, especially from a guy like Jaden McDaniels. But it's gone down even more this season. So that's concerning to say the least. And it hardens Jaden McDaniels' ceiling because he's going to be an elite defender in the NBA for a long, long time. But what's going to take his game to the next level and make him not the guy for the Timberwolves team, because that's Ant, and what's going to make him a true foundational piece for this team, a true top level guy on this team, because I think the true proper foundational pieces on this team, if they hit their peak right now, are Anthony Edwards, Naz Reid, and Jaden McDaniels. And you can put Rob Dillingham in there too. But those are the big three. And Jaden McDaniels, he's so close to being there because he's already an elite defender. But he just needs to work on the offensive game. And he just has not progressed the way that it seemed like he would. Now, he's only 24 years old. He has a lot of time. But it is concerning that with the loss of Cat, it seemed like Jaden could take a step up. But J-Mac has not done that to begin this season. And the Timberwolves could really use it with the way things have been going, especially if Jaden was able to get that three-pointer back, because Anthony Edwards has been taking a lot of threes this season, and credit to him, he's making them. But up to this point in his career, his bread and butter, it's been driving to the rim. And he's able to do other things. That's what makes him so great. But if Jaden was able to get a shot back and just be taking more threes and hitting them, then that would open the door for Anthony Edwards to continue to do what he has always been best at. And obviously, his threes aren't harming him. Anthony Edwards is shooting from with great efficiency, but I do believe that if Jaden McDaniels was able to unlock his offensive game a little bit more and be comfortable from three once again, we would be having entirely different conversations about his role on this team and how impactful he is as a player. Even on defense, it seems like sometimes the greatest defensive players, they only really get attention if they're good on offense too. Because sometimes people will see it as negating that, and as a result, they don't appreciate their great defense. That has happened with Jaden, but I think that he would get even more recognition on that defensive end for the great defender that he is if he was able to hone in on his offensive talent a little bit more. And that's not necessarily his fault, right? I think he deserves all the credit in the world for his defense, but he would get even more recognition for that, more all defensive conversations. He's a great defender in this league, one of the best in the entire NBA. So once again, Jaden McDaniels has been great defensively, and Anthony Edwards has done all this team needs him to do on the offensive end. But if Jaden was able to hone in the offensive game once more and become the best version of himself offensively with the loss of Cat now, that could really take this team to the next level. But the offensive leap has still not happened for Jaden McDaniels. Now, my next point here, and these last two are really kind of intertwined, is Rudy Gobert. He has not been the defender that he was in his past Defensive Player of the Year season. And Rudy's never going to be a negative defender, especially around the rim. He catches some flack for his perimeter defense at times, but even that is serviceable. He can be a good help defender. You just don't necessarily want him on the perimeter all the time. But Gobert this season, even at the rim, he has not been the same player that he usually is. His block percentage and defensive box plus minus are both down. And his defensive block plus minus is actually the lowest it has ever been his entire NBA career. And he's had some good games here and there, dominant on the defensive end, but overall, it has not been nearly the kind of defensive season that we're used to seeing from Rudy Gobert. So that definitely plays a part in this team as well. They've got a good perimeter defense, but when you have a good perimeter defense, that's also that's going to drive them more into the paint, and the answer for this Timberwolves team last year was that you simply had Rudy Gobert over in the paint. But now Gobert is not even performing at the same level. So that's just another detriment to this team. And that brings me on to the last point here. And obviously, the big move they made in the offseason is the loss of Karl Anthony Towns for Julius Randle. Now, if you look at Julius Randle's production in a vacuum, it's absolutely fine. Just over 21 points. And the rebounds are a little bit down from what you would expect from him, but he's playing with guys like Gobert, Nas Reed. Timberwolves have a lot of talented bigs. That's okay. But when you watch the Timberwolves, there's plenty of moments where Julius Randle will have the ball, and he's one of the more on-ball guys on this team because he's going to go out and he's going to drive. And they trust him to be able to do that. But sometimes when you drive, there's not always an answer. You might run into a wall. And so what are you going to do when you run into that wall? You're going to pass it out. And so often there are times where Rudy Gobert is wide open. And sometimes he's wide open even in the paint. And that's his bread and butter. And Julius Randle does not pass it to him. And I think part of that is that this team just does not respect him. And he doesn't have very good hands in terms of passing it. But still, you do have to give him a chance, especially when you have no options available yourself. And so Julius Randle, to start the season, he has been a good driver for this team. And as solid as Julius Randle has been as a driver, and as good as Anthony Edwards has been for what this team needs of him, you can't pass up open opportunities even if you don't necessarily fully trust Gobert, because his value is mostly as a defensive player. But when he's not having his best defensive season, he does need to pick up some of that on the offensive end. Do not even give him the chances to do so. And so to wrap those all up, those are the main factors as to why the Minnesota Timberwolves have not got off to a great start to the season. Can they turn things around? Most likely. I think Rob Dillingham got his most minutes of the season in this most recent game. So that's a good sign, especially with the decline of Mike Conley, to have another solid point guard you can run through. But this is a team that had championship expectations, and they have not lived up to that to start off this season. Part of it is an adjustment with Julius Randle, but part of it is stuff that you would have expected to be already fine-tuned. Like Jaden McDaniels taking a little bit of an offensive leap, like Rudy Gobert being not the best defender that he once was. And that is all for today's episode of State of the Association. Thank you for listening. I'm your host, Nash Roberts.